of course, one of the founding co-founding editors of the Intercept, a journalist, a tireless reporter, a constitutional lawyer, author of several New York Times bestsellers. I thought he was going to be sitting where his awards are behind him, so I was going to just read them right off the wall, but I thankfully have a short list here. All the big ones: the I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism, in 2010, the Online Journalism Award for work on the detention conditions of Chelsea Manning. Let's see, George Polk Award for National Security reporting, and I know it's you know, it's not as important, I think, probably to Glenn as it is to your rank and file reporter, but nevertheless impressive 2014 Pulitzer Prize for public service. So Glenn, thank you very much for joining us. And I thought, you know, we reached out to you a couple of months ago, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, and it kind of struck us as, you strike us as like the perfect, you know, person. Is it fair to say you're kind of already quite used to being stuck in your home, you know, with a temperamental government type of situation way before the rest of us were? You know, used to doing a lot of work from home, doing interviews like this?
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting. My work journalistically last year was consumed almost exclusively starting around May, when a source contacted me with a huge archive of previously secret messages exchanged among top-level Brazilian authorities that revealed systemic corruption that really threatened the Bolsonaro government. The new president at the time, he was just elected 5 months earlier, in a pretty significant way, and it resulted in a lot of death threats from myself, from my husband, who's a member of Congress in Brazil, a left-wing socialist member of Congress. And yeah, leaving the house became kind of a major security operation. We needed teams of armed guards to do it, and armored vehicles and the like. One of our close friends, who's a human rights activist and served on the Rio de Janeiro City Council with my husband, Marielle Franco, was notoriously assassinated the year before. So political violence in Brazil is something you take very seriously. So yeah, as difficult as that was, in some odd way, it did become kind of a practice ground or training session for being quarantined at home.
Unbelievable. And I do want to talk about Operation Car Wash a little bit more. I was going to get to it in a little bit, but I guess you just said something that kind of blew my mind. The documents only came in May, and the first story came out in June, from what I recall. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was contacted actually on Mother's Day, which I think it was May 11th or May 12th. It was a Sunday, by the woman who was the vice presidential candidate on the ticket, the left-wing ticket that ran against Bolsonaro that made the second round runoff. Against him, she was a former member of Congress, Manuela Davila. She was the one who kind of had the first contact with the source, and she called me. And then I began working with the source on May 11th or May 12th, whatever Mother's Day was in Brazil. And our first story was published less than a month later, about something like June 9th, when we published 3 stories at once, along with an editor's note explaining our process and the rationale for it. And one of the reasons why we did that so quickly was because we knew that the target of the journalism was the Minister of Justice, the very, very powerful Minister of Justice, who had previously been the judge overseeing an anti-corruption probe in Brazil. And there was always a very good chance that we were going to be discovered, that it was going to be discovered through surveillance or other kinds of investigative weaponry, that we had this material, that there would be an attempt to prevent pre-publication any kind of reporting on it. And so we wanted to do it as fast as possible, obviously consistent with journalistic standards, since we knew every word was going to be dissected and picked apart. And if we made even a small error, it would forever ruin the credibility of the reporting. So we kind of had to balance the need for speed with the need for extreme levels of accuracy and precision.
How much time do you spend on, you know, and how much resources do you spend investigating the surveillance of your team during these projects, after these projects? You know, how much of your headspace does that take up? it's kind of like it's kind of like a job on top of a job. And how important is that to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's, obviously my views of journalism were radically shaped or reshaped by the work that I did in 2012 and then into 2013 and 2014 with Edward Snowden and with those documents and the need for digital security, the very extreme need for digital security, not just to prevent governments from discovering what we had prior to our publishing, which we were very worried about, but also our obligation to protect the material from acquisition by other governments or other non-state actors as well. So from the very start of my working with Edward Snowden, digital security, which at the time, very few journalists were actually thinking about, almost no, even major media outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post had digital security specialists on their staff. It was really something that, just the knowledge that the surveillance state had become so pervasive and obviously had a big impact on journalists, brought a lot of awareness, first to myself, but to the broader profession. And so having spent huge amounts of time necessarily thinking about how to be digitally secure in our materials, secure in our journalism, source protection, elevated drastically that priority for me. And so when we created the Intercept in the end of 2013, when I left the Guardian to create the Intercept, the first people we hired were not journalists or writers or editors, but technology specialists. We recruited the top digital security specialists from around the world to come and work with us, knowing that being able to build a newsroom that could guarantee anonymity, that could innovate ways for sources to communicate with journalists in a way that was secure, enabling journalists to work with large archives, was not only an obligation that we had ethically, but also could forge a new kind of journalism by enabling mass leaks, encouraging them and fostering them, that could really open up a lot of walls that had been constructed by power centers to prevent people from knowing what they're doing.
Yeah, it's funny. There's this scene in Citizen 4, I think it's probably from like 8 years ago, where you're just kind of casually in your chair, in your backyard, writing like that. And of course, in my head, it's always been you surrounded by computers and specialists and in a locked vault. These days, you're still writing at length. Do you have a process? Do you write all over the place? Is it still kind of that backyard experience with, I do want to talk about the dogs, with the dogs surrounding you and such?
I do still have the dogs surrounding me, but pretty much everything else has changed. It's kind of like with anything. You assess the risk of each particular story, and you don't want to be excessive or neurotic about security risks, because using security measures really can limit your sense of movement and your sense of ability to communicate. So you don't want to be excessive about it. It's not as though the more is always better in each case. But when you're working on sensitive stories that are actually very threatening to governments or to centers of authority, when you're working with classified or secret material, when you have a need for source protection, then the protocol becomes very complicated. And so, yeah, where I work, the machines and devices that I use, how I communicate, the caution that has to be exercised elevates significantly whenever those considerations are at a higher point.
Let's talk about a couple of those stories. So I want to talk about the Martina Navratilova story in a minute. I read the whole thing last night. My mind is just blown. I didn't know about a lot of that stuff going on. But first, let's talk about some of these high-level stories. So these are from the Intercept in the past couple of weeks. How the House Armed Services Committee, in the middle of a pandemic, approved a huge military budget and more war in Afghanistan. House Democrats working with Liz Cheney restrict Trump's planned withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and Germany. Of course, these are like classic Glenn Greenwald. This stuff's going on while all this other stuff's going on, and people aren't really, aren't paying attention. More money during a pandemic for war. Of course, you have a huge platform, million Twitter followers. Intercept is massive. but still sometimes, are you thinking, you know, why aren't more people interested in these stories? And you know, what keeps you pushing on them? And these stories on Liz Cheney, I just have to say, have been particularly fascinating. The most of the media, you know, I didn't even realize what Trump's beef with Liz Cheney was really about. I thought it was all superficial. I thought it was all COVID. And then doing some research for speaking with you, here it is. You know, it's all war underneath. So I'm just kind of wondering, you know, what keeps you always, and listen, we do this at a local level here, but you know, all these just massive stories, what keeps you going on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, you know, I think maybe it's because of the way that I began doing what I didn't think of at the time was journalism, but in fact was journalism, which is, you know, in 2005, I just created a blog on a free blogging platform called Blogspot, which was owned by Google. I don't think it exists anymore. Maybe it does, but not very many people use it.
Find the old Glenn Greenwald Blogspot and post it.
Oh yeah, no, believe me, people find that very frequently and use it all the time. People love to go back 15 years and find things that you said that they think reflect poorly on you. It's a great resource for people who like to do that. And you know, at the time I was still working as a lawyer, as a constitutional lawyer. I had just moved to Brazil because I had met my husband who's Brazilian, and we decided we were, you know, in love and wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. But I was still going back to the US a lot and working on my law practice, going back and forth constantly. So I started a blog, and the point of the blog was to talk about things and cover things that I thought were A, important, and B, not receiving as much attention as they ought to. Obviously, there were a lot of issues in the Bush-Cheney era, the first term of the Bush-Cheney president administration and the second, that were important and received a lot of attention. And I didn't write about those very much, not because I didn't care, but because no one needed me to write about those. I didn't have the kind of platform where if I wasn't covering something, I wasn't Walter Cronkite, who had an obligation to tell everyone everything important every day. I felt like my role was to talk about the things that were being ignored that needed attention. And to this very day, even as my platform has grown, I'm the co-founder of my own news outlet now that, you know, employs dozens of editors and journalists around the world. I still very much see my role that way. So, you know, during the Trump administration, there have been a lot of people kind of angry with me or resentful or critical that I don't spend as much time as they would like denouncing Trump. And the reason I don't isn't because I don't see the same things that everybody else sees about all the terrible parts of his presidency. It's because I just don't feel like people need me to be saying the same things that you can turn on MSNBC every night and hear, or pick up the New York Times op-ed page and read. It's just redundant. You know, it'd be easier for me. My life would be a lot easier if I did those things because people would applaud more and it would be less pushback and less work. But the things that I feel like I can contribute that still interest and excite me and cause my journalistic passion to remain high is when I get to shine a light on things that I feel like no one else has been paying attention to. So I, you know, watched I saw the news that there was a pending bill to authorize almost $1 trillion, $750 billion in military spending in the middle of a pandemic when tens of millions of people are newly unemployed, when we're on the verge of economic collapse. The Fed is floating the US economy by a thread in a very artificial way. At some point, that's all going to come crashing down. And we just authored, there was a bill in Congress pending to spend three times more than the next highest military spender, which is China, who spends $250 million a year, even though it has a population 4 times greater than the US. And it's a budget, a military budget that is more than the next 15 countries combined. So I wanted to understand why that was happening and who was doing it. And so I watched all 14 hours of the House Armed Services Committee. And when you do stuff like that, you see things that are much different than kind of the narrative that you pick up watching the Rachel Maddow show or Wolf Blitzer. You know, what I saw was not Republicans, because they don't control the House where bills that authorize expenditures have to originate, but Democrats taking the lead and working not with left-wing Democrats who were opposed to all of these things, but to the war hawks in the Republican Party, led by Liz Cheney, the actual daughter of Dick Cheney, who's now a congresswoman from Wyoming. And they were working together to exclude the anti-war voices on the left, like from Ro Khanna and Tulsi Gabbard, people like that, but also the ones on the right, like Matt Gaetz, who was saying, you know, make America first to me means stop spending money with troops in Afghanistan and bring them home so we can spend money on American workers who have lost their jobs, or let's take troops out of Germany the way President Trump wants to because it's so expensive and there's no Soviet Union anymore that needs deterring. So when you watch that, you see things in a much different way, that it's not this Democrat versus Republican war that drives things in Washington. It's often establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans working hand in hand in a way that they don't want either of their fan bases to know, on behalf of lobbyists and corporate interests and weapons manufacturers and the like, and sometimes even against the Trump administration, which does still try and reduce militarism for whatever motives it might have in doing that. So you just get a much different perspective. And I feel like my platform is much better used showing people that, even if they don't want to see it, than just kind of echoing what lots of other people are already saying.
All you young reporters watching this, tattoo that on your arm. And so, you know, a story like that, though, you know, you'll do it, the Intercept will do it, and, you know, then we'll start to see, you know, maybe it won't get as much attention as it deserves, but we will see it pop up in some places. And there's got to be, you know, some gratification in that. But some other stories, you know, you put out a big piece today about Bolivia, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's a great example of a lot of what I want to talk about. And because I just realized, you know, in watching it, how proper, you know, I'm supposed to be a media critic of sorts myself. And, you know, I just kind of, I guess, believed a lot of the bullshit myself. The Sunday afternoon, I guess I'm only 40, but I'll watch the Sunday shows occasionally, you know, just to see what's going on. And frankly, you know, until really reading, I didn't really understand what happened with Evo Morales. But how, you know, how propagandized is U.S. media on Bolivia? And when you do stories and the reporting you do, and you see less movement from other outlets, even when they mess things up, as the New York Times and other outlets have on the Bolivia story, how frustrating is that? You know, here you are, a big outlet, you know, you're not, you know, shouting from the shadows, and yet it's completely ignored sometimes. Because, you know, I know what it's like to feel like that, but I'm wondering what it's like for you to feel like that, even with a mega platform.
Yeah, you know, the idea of propaganda is incredibly important for journalism, because in my view, if I had to kind of define what the primary function of journalism is, it would be to combat propaganda from powerful media, governmental, and corporate factions. And I don't talk about propaganda from some kind of like mountaintop as a guru. I talk about it really as someone who was kind of victimized by it. You know, when I did start writing about politics for the first time, I wasn't somebody who was spending every day digging deep into things like the House Armed Services Committee. I was getting my news from like doing the things that I thought high level news consumers did. Like I read the New York Times, I had a subscription to the Atlantic or the New Yorker. And I kind of read it and feel like, okay, I'm informed enough to like talk to smart people at dinner parties in an informed way about, you know, Latin America or NATO or whatever. And then once I was able to kind of start really digging deep into primary sources and, you know, taking the time to question those assumptions that get fed to us and with which we're bombarded and indoctrinated every day, I started realizing how much of it was just false. Not necessarily because the people disseminating it themselves were necessarily lying, although sometimes they were, but because they too were just indoctrinated with. We're all indoctrinated with cultural propaganda, that, you know, prevailing orthodoxies in our society. It takes a lot of time and energy and effort and work to combat that, to liberate ourselves from it, to understand why it's deceptive. So, you know, it is difficult. It is frustrating when you see it, but it's coming from so many different places that no matter how big your platform is, you can't actually, you know, undermine it and subvert it in the way that you want. In the case of Bolivia, it was obvious to me what was happening from the beginning, just because we've seen it. How many times have we seen military coups going back to the Cold War against democratically elected left of center governments, replaced by the military force with the right-wing government, while the U.S. applauds, if not actively participates? You recognize the propaganda. Oh, somehow the democratically elected president that was just ousted, he was the one that was the threat to democracy. The military that just used force to expel him from the country and install a right-wing leader that could never get elected on their own, they're somehow the ones saving democracy.
The opposite.
So you see that right away.
It's a complete opposite story is all I was saying. So
yeah, it's just Orwellian. And you know, it took a while in the case of Bolivia. It took 8 months for the New York Times finally to acknowledge that a lot of the premises that were used to justify the coup in mainstream U.S. media circles, including in the New York Times, were themselves fraudulent. So it's just, you know, it's a constant struggle to make sure that you're doing what you can to push back against that.
Are there kinds of articles or, you know, topics in particular that you find the public has particular trouble digesting? And, you know, since we have, you know, this is primarily the audience is journalists, you know, what are some ways that you, find ways to, you know, I don't know, make them sexy, but to really make them palatable, make them, to make them good headlines that stick, that have legs, that, you know, reach beyond people who, you know, just go to the Intercept every morning?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. You know, there are really good journalists I know who think that thinking about how to make stories sexy or appealing, interesting is like beneath them. You know, it's like that's the kind of stuff that you think about if you're a reality TV show host or like a wrestling promoter. But you know, for me, journalism is not like art, right? Like, or poetry. You can produce art and poetry that is really extraordinary and beautiful that nobody reads while you're alive. Maybe nobody reads ever, but it doesn't change the fact that it's really beautiful at like the highest quality. So maybe if you're a poet or an artist, you don't need to think about how to gain exposure for your work. Like, you're just content to produce whatever you can at the highest level. For me, that's not journalism. There's no such thing as good journalism that nobody reads, because journalism is about making an impact in the society. And to make an impact in the society, to improve society, to combat injustice, you need to get people interested. So when I first started blogging, for example, I would purposely pick fights with people who had bigger audiences than I did, because people like conflict. And I didn't pick and believe in, you know, I didn't fabricate disagreement or conflict where none existed just to get attention for myself. It was just that if I wanted to make a certain point, bring attention to an issue, I would do it by creating conflict with somebody and then attacking them in a way that I knew people would find entertaining. Because you have to build a platform and an audience in order to make an impact. And if you don't think about how to make your journalism engaging for people and how to expand the audience that's hearing it, for me, it's not only self-indulgent to refuse to think about those things, but it's kind of an abdication of one of your responsibilities as a journalist, which is to find ways to convince the public to pay attention to the things that you're reporting.
You know, and look, you just reminded me of you know, I know you like to go toe to toe, but how do you feel about Michael Hayden, former CIA NSA director, writing that debating you is like looking the devil in the eye? You don't. It's going all right for me, right? You know, I don't see any Medusa anything going on. So yeah, that's such a wild thing to have said about you by him, of all people. Sorry, but you were just talking about debating, just kind of, and I guess that's kind of, you've been debating since high school, I learned recently.
Yeah. I mean, I've been debating since, you know, as my mother would have told you, and frequently told everybody she could find, much to my chagrin and embarrassment, you know, that I was debating everybody since I was 4. It's just an ingrained part of my personality. But yeah, I did end up on the high school debate team and then also on the college debate team, and then went to law school. So that trajectory was always kind of there for me. But like ultimately, one of the things I tell young journalists or, like people in journalism school or young journalists starting out when they ask for advice and the like is, look, if one of your goals in life is to be universally admired and appreciated and adored, don't go into journalism, because journalism is necessarily an antagonistic profession. If you're not antagonizing people, you're not doing your job correctly. And who you're antagonizing matters a lot to me. So honestly, I'm actually not at home, even though this office that I'm in looks weirdly like my home office, as you observed before. I'm traveling at the moment, but when I think about all my accomplishments in journalism, the prizes and the awards that you mentioned that are usually behind me on the wall aren't the ones that I value the most. It's things like George Bush's CIA and NSA chief after 9/11 saying that debating me is like looking into the eyes of the devil. I want to be the devil for people like that. That's what I see my function as being.
That's great. All right, so we kind of, I guess I had a couple, I don't know, not personal, just more personal questions. So I guess that's a good segue. So I want to talk about for those who are just tuning in, and of course we're speaking with Glenn Greenwald, your latest story, your latest Intercept piece, July 14th, how cancel culture repeatedly emerged in my attempt to make a film about tennis legend Martina Navratilova. We'll get to the cancel culture, but there's about 3,000 words before that. Can you just talk about, it's really passionate about growing up, loving tennis, loving Martina Navratilova, having this as a hero, and particularly, you said this is the first person, I think, from tweeting at you that you were ever starstruck by, and you had to add in that included Daniel Ellsberg, and I just wondering why you had to throw that elbow. I interviewed Ellsberg once, very disarming, very nice guy. I was totally starstruck, but I don't know, for you, just can you tell us why Martina Navratilova really was just that towering figure for you throughout your life?
I mean, look, I love Dan Ellsberg. Dan Ellsberg was one of my childhood heroes, as I mentioned in the article. But the point I was making is that, when people look at my work and the trajectory of my life, some of the childhood heroes that I had are very expected, are very predictable. Daniel Ellsberg, obviously, the Pentagon Papers leaker who blew the whistle on the lies of the U.S. government during the Vietnam War is an obvious hero of mine. Right. And I've developed a very close friendship with him. He and I co-created, along with Edward Snowden and Laura Poitras and others, a group to protect press freedom, and I sit on the board with him. But other people that I admired were like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. I was obsessed with All the President's Men. Again, a really obvious sort of childhood hero or set of childhood heroes. But the person who really occupied this unique pedestal for me was Martina Navratilova, who's not at all obvious, right? She's a lesbian tennis player from the Iron Curtain, like one of the least obvious people who would be my childhood heroes. And I really, she really like occupied an important emotional place for me growing up, because I grew up, I was born in 1967. So in 1980, I turned 13. I was growing up as a gay child and then a gay teenager and really starting to kind of explore and understand and accept that side of me right as the Reagan era started, which is very much based in this kind of new form of social conservatism, the moral majority, ushering in this very kind of harsh Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell-led denunciation, the kind of fire and brimstone form of Christianity that condemns sinners that was integrated into American politics. And then at the same time, the only discussion of gay culture or gay people was associated with this literally fatal epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, which began right, as I became a teenager in the early 1980s. And at the time, it's very hard for people to realize because the changes are so radical, like 14-year-old kids go to their prom, their junior high prom with like their same-sex partner. So people don't understand how radical, a lot of people don't, who are of a certain age, how radical the change has been from the 1980s and the 1990s to now. And growing up as a teenager in the 1980s, where you had no role model, no one that you could even identify with, there was this woman who was one of the most famous people on the planet. You know, I think also people don't remember how significant her rivalry with Chris Evert, the U.S. tennis star, was. She was one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. You know, Sports Illustrated at the end of this century did the 100 greatest athletes of the 20th century. And she was number 19 on the list. The second highest woman, I think one space behind Ty Cobb and one in front of Ted Williams. You know, I mean, she was up there with like the legends of sports. But then at the same time, she was this, you know, remarkably defiant figure. She was openly gay. She hired a trans woman as her coach, Renee Richards. She traveled the world with her wife, who at the time, you know, nobody did anything like that. She was an immigrant to the United States and yet became this outspoken political dissident. And so everything about her was just very defiant and very individualistic, and just this refusal to capitulate to societal orthodoxies or demands, and instead always prioritizing her own individual self-actualization. I never thought about any of that. I never realized why I loved her so much until, you know, as you referenced, we started interacting in the wake of the Snowden reporting, and I became so excited in a way that, as I was saying, I didn't even for Dan Ellsberg or any world leaders that I've interviewed and spoken to, where I don't, just doesn't is me, but with her, it did. And so it kind of made me reevaluate, like, why did this woman have this profound impact on me when I was growing up? What does it say about role models? And so decided to do a film that would explore those questions. We found a partner in Reese Witherspoon, who was incredibly enthusiastic about the project, who's, you know, one of the biggest names in Hollywood. So that was a huge coup to be able to do that. And so I kind of just wanted to write the article about some of the roadblocks we experienced along the way, what it says about our current political discourse, and just also to explain the film, because it's been 2 years and I haven't been able to make it.
I think that, you know, that I really recommend the article, everybody out there. I've seen, you know, you've been sparring, not necessarily about your article as much as about Matt Taibbi's latest piece and such. I think one thing that's blown me away is, for those who are watching, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the Harper's letter about cancel culture, which you, from what I understand, were canceled from. We're not asked to sign because you were canceled for your Russiagate writing. So you are kind of like on your own island. I think I really don't know. Is that how it feels? Do you, or you, I mean, you don't, you know, you have your team at the Intercept and such, but you don't seem like someone who's out there trying to get allies to form a Twitter mob. Do you feel kind of alone? I mean, obviously, I know you and Matt Taibbi have been pals for a while, so that's one thing. But, you know, what's it, you know, where do you stand?
Yeah, look, I mean, you know, one of the reasons why I was able to build such a large and ultimately, you know, influential platform was because I had a very loyal readership who went with me everywhere, from my blog to Salon to The Guardian to the Intercept, and the readership grew. You know, they still are, like, very loyal. And it's one of the things that enabled me to be heard, right? So if I criticized a bigger fish in the media pond, you know, 10 years ago, they would be harassed everywhere they went by my followers, by my fans. So on the one hand, you know, I've had a lot of support, for sure, for the work that I've done. You know, I've won every journalism award in multiple countries, so I don't want to self-victimize and say I'm, you know, kind of excluded and ostracized and oppressed. I mean, it's not I don't make a very good victim that way. But at the same time, you know, one of the things that I do think is important is that if you build that kind of loyal following, it can become its own prison. You can start being captive to it, you know, like afraid of losing it. And I remember the first time it happened was in the wake of the Citizens United ruling, which for everybody on slightly or greatly to the left of center Citizens United was the satanic ruling. Everyone agreed, from establishment Democrats to communists and everyone in between, people who hate each other. Usually they were all on board with the idea that this ruling was awful. And there were a couple of us, including the ACLU, that agreed with the majority ruling in that case, that we don't want the government telling people that they can't spend their money on political advertisements. That case grew out of a group that had produced a film shortly before an election that was critical of Hillary Clinton. The law prohibited it, a classic restriction of speech, political speech. And so there were a couple of us, like the ACLU and Elliot Spitzer and myself, and maybe that's it, who agreed with the majority in Citizens United. And I remember having to write a column. I didn't want to write about it. People were saying, why haven't you written about it, right? It's the obvious thing for me to write about. It's a major Supreme Court ruling. I'm a constitutional lawyer. It involves freedom of the First Amendment. Everybody was talking about it. I knew I didn't write about it because I knew everybody expected me to rage and spew contempt for the decision, but I didn't. That wasn't my view. And I was going to have to alienate my readership in a very significant way for the first time, and I did. And one of the things I ultimately learned from that is that it's very liberating to do that, because ultimately there are people who just want someone who just repeatedly and on a daily basis vindicates and affirms their preconceptions and ideological dogma. There definitely are people who want that. And if you don't do that, they're not going to be interested in you. But I think what people want more than anything is somebody that they can trust, that whatever it is that you're saying because it's really what you believe. It's grounded in your convictions and your best attempt to analyze and understand the world, not because you're being calculating or, trying to construct your best careerist path, but because you're just being honest and sometimes it's comfortable and sometimes it's going to produce a disagreement. But thankfully, there are enough people who want that from journalists that I've been able to continue to kind of alienate people, with some frequency, and still maintain a loyal readership.
And I don't know if you've been asked, would you have signed the letter? Would you? Is that something you would have been enthusiastic about, or would it be? It's just too predictable that you had a shitstorm coming at you the next day?
Since I wasn't asked, I never had to kind of make that decision. If I didn't sign it, the only reason for not signing it would have been that I'm just in general not comfortable signing on to statements that have to be kind of diluted by committee to attract as many people. Like, why do I need to sign on to a letter written by other people that is constructed to attract the support of as many people as possible? Just go write my own column and my own views using the words that I want, including expressing support for that letter, but in the words that I'd want to use. So I was definitely supportive of the general principles of that letter. I understand and agree with the concerns that drove it. If I had been asked to sign it, as I said, my only reason for possibly saying no would have just been a generalized preference for expressing myself with my own words rather than other people's.
Thanks. All right, so we have about 15, 20 minutes left. If it's all right with you, I'd like to do a little lightning round just because there's a lot of stuff. And then
let's go.
There's already some great questions on the chat, so I'll go to those.
Okay.
Right. All right, cool. So we haven't really spoken about coronavirus at all. It's obviously we have to at least briefly. But I've been kind of watching California as this unbelievable hotspot is kind of blown me away. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in particular. What's it like to watch kind of the map in the U.S. from abroad? Any reactions?
I to the extent I've been focused journalistically on the coronavirus, it's been more in Brazil, where if you were to rank world leaders in terms of horrible, inept, and shameful and disgraceful performances, Jair Bolsonaro would be easily the first person on the list, well ahead of his competitors, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, to the point that he seems to be actively encouraging the infection to spread as opposed to just failing to take the measures that science would require. on top of which, the coronavirus in Brazil has just been a little bit more tragic because the grotesque income inequality that has plagued the country for decades means that tens of millions of people, when they do contract the virus, don't have access even to minimal health care, let alone the kind of health care that would be necessary to treat a disease of this lethality. Watching it in the US, you know, I mean, one of the things that I thought was a little bit odd, that's not a very popular observation to make, is that we did hear for 3 or 4 months one very consistent absolute message, which was it's irresponsible to leave your home for any reason, no matter how careful you're being, and that if you do that, you're a selfish person, to the point where there was that lawyer who became a admired celebrity because he dressed up as the Grim Reaper and he went to the beach, deserted beaches where people were distancing in order to shame them. And then all of a sudden, at the end of May, when George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department and hundreds of thousands of people poured out onto the street, one on top of the next, in order to protest an obviously just cause, suddenly the messaging changed. Health professionals themselves started sanctioning this behavior, which days earlier they had been, you know, insisting was reckless and irresponsible. And it started to concern me that this pandemic, which was treated as a health problem at first, was starting to become very politicized in a way that I felt like was going to produce some bad results in the United States. It was going to become part of the culture war, whether you wear a mask or not. People on the right had been told they can't protest lockdowns. And then 2 weeks later, we're watching protests that were way larger being celebrated. And you could just kind of see the politicization of this pandemic coming. And you knew that that was going to lead to bad outcomes. And I think it has.
How about federal troops deployed to some cities, you know, on the backs of some of these protests? And
yeah,
also,
I think it's
how different is that? How different is that from what you know already? I mean, you know, I was blocks from the bombing of the Boston Marathon. There were 150 MRAPs on Boston Common within 5 minutes. I don't know where they are all the time, hidden in the Batmobile basement, I suppose. But you know, how different is what, you know, Trump is threatening, what's actually transpiring, like right now, I believe in Albuquerque and Portland, you know, from the, you know, everyday preparedness of the National Guard, say.
Yeah, you know, the book that I was working on when my life was upended last year by the source in Brazil who provided that archive to me was a book about how the war on terror, which really has been the primary focus of my career as a journalism for the past decade, and the abuses and the tyrannical powers invoked in its name applied to foreign nationals in foreign countries, is being rapidly imported domestically, not just in the United States, but also Western Europe, in order to militarize these countries that are starting to experience serious domestic internal instability for the first time, largely because of growing income inequality and the disappearance of economic security for tens of millions of people that so far has manifested in things like Brexit or the election of Donald Trump. But you've seen things like mass protest movements in Paris with the yellow vests, instability in Spain with the separatist movement, kind of an instability that we haven't seen in the West since the end of World War II that is now obviously starting to threaten social stability. And societies kind of have two alternatives when that happens. They can either appease that inequality by distributing resources more equitably, or they can just build up force in order to smash and repress and stifle any attempts to rebel against it. And Western societies have chosen the latter, in large part by militarizing. And one of the ways in the United States that has happened is that you look at the pictures of the neighborhood cop on his beat in the 1950s, and now look at the police forces in major American cities who look like, you know, something out of Terminator 8, or the army in Baghdad, and you can viscerally see that evolution that began long before Trump got inaugurated and these protests erupted. But people are seeing the power that's in the hands of the federal government to use police forces to smash any kind of serious protest movement.
I'm gonna transition to a question from Grant Smith. Actually, I'm sorry, it's from Gino Canella. So As quote unquote, I'm an editor of an alternative weekly, kind of. I wouldn't, if there was a playbook, it would be a similar one to to what you find. I think there is at the Intercept. It's been great for me to see at least some objectivity thrown out the window at some more mainstream news sources. But Gino brings up kind of now Ben Smith's critique of Ronan Farrow's work and of resistance journalism. And Gino, who's a professor at Emerson College, thinking about issues of objectivity, traditional journalistic norms, and social media incentives. How and what should journalists resist? And I just want to add in there that, I think there's a difference between the critiques of what Farrow's doing and of actual errors in his reporting. But with that said, how do you feel about that, about attacks on that kind of journalism?
Yeah, it's incredibly ironic because one of the reasons I started writing about politics, and one of the main focal points of my writing early on, was a media critique. And the media critique was that this kind of corporatized, bloodless, soulless notion of objectivity, where journalists could never even appear to be siding with one side of the debate over the other, even if one side was based in factual truth and the other was based in deceit and lies, was rendering journalism neutered on purpose, because large corporations that started in the 60s and 70s to control the biggest media outlets, want neutered journalism. They don't want to have confrontations with power centers because their interest as corporations are prejudiced by adversarial journalism. So they created this kind of model that never existed, that journalists are supposed to be closed and inexpressive and never near any kind of opinion or passion or view that looks like siding with one side or the other. To the point where one of the things that angered me the most during the Bush years was the fact that the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and NBC refused to call the torture techniques used by the Bush administration torture. They called it enhanced interrogation techniques. They adopted the euphemisms on the grounds that, well, look, some people say this is torture, meaning like the entire world, international law, The Hague, US precedent in courts. And then some people say it's not torture, meaning like Dick Cheney and John Yoo. So who are we as journalists to take a side and say who's right and who's not? So we can't call it torture because that means we're siding with this side. This kind of objectivity, quote unquote, or neutrality, makes journalism worthless. It protects power centers. It ensures that the vibrancy is drained out of journalism. So I've always been an advocate of the kind of journalism that says, show your cards. Don't pretend that you are a journalist or a human being that resides above political debates, because people know that's a fraud. So when I was reporting on the Snowden documents, I was simultaneously being very meticulous to describe what these documents revealed, but then at the same time acknowledging what was obvious anyway, which was that I was an opponent of mass indiscriminate surveillance and the invasions of privacy it ushered in, because I felt like that was a more honest voice for me to use, and therefore one that would inspire more credibility. Whereas if I had pretended that I didn't have an opinion, I was just there to deliver facts, I think I would have felt like I was defrauding people. And when we created the Intercept, a major premise of it was one of the things it was going to do differently was it was going to liberate journalists to have a voice that was passionate. I had a long debate in the New York Times, the pages of the New York Times, with the previous executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, about exactly that question, about whether journalists should maintain this veneer of neutrality and objectivity, which he obviously thought journalists should, or whether that was killing journalism by draining it of its vibrancy and passion, because journalism was created, the freedom of the press was created to be a weapon against injustice, to enable crusading against injustice. It is true that in the Trump era, ironically, that model of journalism that I always envisioned has become the adopted model. You turn on CNN and the on-screen graphic is not Trump says X, Y, and Z, but Trump says X, Y, and Z, comma, which is a lie.
So places that have stopped having you that are now acting like that, though they haven't now rolled out the red carpet back and re-invited.
No, they haven't, which is fine. But the concern that I have is, and I do believe this, is that this isn't a revolution in how journalism is going to be conducted. I think it's very much a singular reaction to Trump, so that once Trump is gone and there's a more kind of traditional, respectable person back in the Oval Office that they're comfortable with, whether Mike Pence or Joe Biden or whoever, kind of fits the mold of prior presidents, I absolutely believe journalism is going to instantly revert to its prior mode of speaking in that stilted, artificial, and ultimately fraudulent manner designed to persuade people that journalists reside above the political opinions which ordinary mortals are plagued by.
Interesting. All right. Well, then, we're wrapping up soon. And not like there are so many silver linings, not like there's so much hope, but other than the Intercept, where are some go-to places maybe that you really like to visit, even particularly journalistic, but resource-wise that that reporters should know about. I once asked Christopher Hitchens the same question, and he told he said to the class that something really obnoxious about how I get phone calls from people in high places all day, and I see you as somebody who is kind of less trusting of those phone calls and of kind of more going out on your own. Where do you go? What are the secret troves? I mean, short of being handed big briefcases full of documents, metaphorically speaking, where places where should these young reporters, aim to write for?
Look, I mean, in a weird way, I mean, I consider myself a child of the internet, even though my actual childhood took place before the internet existed. I say that in the sense that my experience in young adulthood, and certainly as a journalist, is very much tied to the internet. I became a journalist with a recognizable platform despite not ever having to go to work for a major newsroom or submit to editorial control. I built my audience with my own hands, on my own, with no constraints of any kind. And huge numbers of other people have done the same. We talk all the time about the toxicity of Twitter and how social media degrades discourse, and it does do all those things. But what it also has done is allowed incredibly smart, independent-minded, insightful people who have no institutional limitations or constraints to be able to reach a large audience or a mid-sized audience or a small audience. And all the time I just run into people's Twitter accounts who are writing and saying really interesting things that I then follow and that shape how I think about things. Or I look for podcasts that are people who are just kind of talking, who are interesting, informed, independent-minded people. And I much prefer the less known they are. It's sort of on the reverse Chris Hitchens, I guess, in this regard, Christopher Hitchens. The less known they are, the more confidence I have that I'm going to find wisdom in what they're saying. Whereas the more established they are, the higher places they occupy, the more confident I am I'm going to be misled. So, be creative, be inventive. If you're a young journalist, especially, how to navigate the internet better than people my age do. Don't accept the premise that if somebody doesn't have a blue check mark next to their name or a certain number of followers, or that they're not associated with a particular news outlet or institution that you recognize, that they have nothing of worth to say. Often those are the people who have the most interesting and provocative things to say that can really be the best resources for you.
Well, I guess so. My final question on that is, most of the reporters on this are in Massachusetts, which I don't know how aware, which is the unbelievable lack of transparency, often rated one of the least transparent states. Sure, you get your documents a lot. You're legendary for it, but of course, you've had to hold a lot of people accountable where there's not a lot that's visible. So, do you have any kind of advice for for those who are working against institutions that are trying to keep it that way? Our legislature, for example, that won't allow us to file FOIA requests. What are some tips for writing around a lack of public info and access.
Yeah, look, there are inside of all of these institutions, not usually at the top, but in the middle or lower, people who are unsympathetic to what these institutions are doing and who often know more about how they work than the people who run them. And those people oftentimes want to bring transparency to those institutions, but feel fearful about their ability to do it without being caught and punished and fired and sanctioned and having their lives ruined. And so one of the things as a journalist that you can do is think about how to create, for lack of a better term, a safe space for people who want to give you information, who have the ability to do it in a way that lets them feel safe, that for you to demonstrate that you've given thought about how to create channels for people like that to provide you information anonymously, that you're going to do everything within your power to protect them, that you're going to prioritize source protection and the kind of communication security we were talking about earlier to minimize the chances that they can be discovered, and devote yourself to that. There are journalists like there's someone named Ken Klippenstein who writes for The Nation, who's built a huge Twitter following, and basically all he ever does, and when I say all he ever does, I don't mean to minimize it. I mean, it's an amazing thing that he's done through something so simple, is he just periodically says, if you work inside this particular agency, I'm really interested in finding out the truth about this policy. Here's my signal number, or here's my DMs, which are open. Please contact me. And it's amazing how many times that's worked for him, because he's telling the people who have this information, I'm really interested in what you have to say. I want to create an avenue for you to make it known, and I'm going to do the things necessary to let you do that safely. So I think having journalists think more about how to reach those kinds of people as opposed to cultivating relationships with the people who run things is a really important cultural change that journalism can embrace, that I think will open up these channels even more.
Great advice. Well, thank you very much. Let you know, I will shiny review to Chomsky's critique, and I recommend to anybody to if it will make you laugh for hours. And we really appreciate your spending time with all these reporters. We're gonna get this a lot of great advice in there, and I really check it out. Hit the Intercept. Definitely read the Martina Navratilova, the attempt documentary. And again, Greenwald, thank you very much. We'll keep following.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was excellent. Thanks again.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
All right, bye-bye.